Today we're going to pivot, kind of from the more psychological dimensions of political culture, what people think, believe, feel about politics, and we're going to talk about structural dimensions of the country that have to do with, in particular, the level of economic development. And a concept I want to introduce to you, which I think you have encountered in one class or another, a somewhat different way to measure, a more rounded way to measure economic development that we call human development, and that the United Nations Development Program has developed an innovative measure for. And what we want to know is there a relationship between how wealthy, educated, prosperous, healthy a society is and the probability that we'll be a democracy and maybe even a liberal democracy, although that's not what we're going to look at today. Okay, and there's a long literature here, which I'm going to introduce you to today, that says there is a relationship. We're going to come back to the political culture dimension because it turns out that the most powerful and assertive theorists arguing that there is a relationship between economic development and democracy believe that political culture is the intervening variable in the relationship, that one crucial way, the most important way, that economic development makes it more likely that countries will be a democracy and makes it more likely that countries will sustain a democracy is by changes in the political culture and the attitudes, values, and beliefs and behavioral inclinations of ordinary citizens. Okay, so we start, look, I know this is an old article, okay? It's now exactly 60 years old. We're celebrating the 60th birthday of Seymour Martin Lipset's famous article in the American Political Science Review, which was then republished the following year in his book Political Man, which he then brought out a new edition of in the late 1970s with more evidence, arguing that, and dating all the way back to Aristotle, who he had, read extensively, that perhaps the most common generalization about political systems and their relationship to other aspects of society, involves the level of economic development. The more well-to-do a nation, the greater the chances it will sustain democracy. This sentence here is one of the most quoted sentences in certainly comparative politics, right? It has spawned, a whole two and a half generations of research and testing and further argumentation about the relationship between the level of economic development of a country and its probability of being a democracy. Now, I don't require you or expect you to read every minute statistical detail of the famous Lipset article. It's a very crude and simple way of taking a first cut at the relationship between some indicators of economic development and the level of probability of democracy. But just kind of note the overall evidence in his, at the time, truly groundbreaking and still immensely influential paper, that there was a step pattern in terms of the average levels of economic development in the world at the time, in the late 1950s. The Western European and English-speaking stable democracies were the richest countries in the world. Then came some European and English-speaking unstable democracies and dictatorships. Keep in mind, back then, Spain was a dictatorship. Portugal was a dictatorship. They were kind of the next level of economic development. And then he looked at Latin America, and within Latin America, the countries that were democracies, or at least sometimes had been democracies and were moving back and forth, had the highest levels of economic development within Latin America, and then the lowest levels of economic development in Latin America were in the entrenched dictatorships. That was the kind of simple pattern. Now, we can question his methods, feel free to do so at any time, in any way you want. We can question his evidence. It was a kind of first heuristic, suggestive argument that spawned a wealth of much more systematic and sophisticated statistical analysis. I'll go over one of the really highly influential later statistical analyses by Adam Przeworski and his colleagues in a few minutes, but let me just note the reality today. I just want to break it down in a very simple way and just look at the empirical pattern. And the way I want to do it is with a different type of step pattern. Let's take all the countries in the world, 190 plus, or whichever ones we can get data on. Let's group them in two ways. First, by their level of per capita income, okay? The method I favor in using that is to take a measure of income that controls for the difference in prices so we can see what the real meaningful level of a country's dollar income is. Because if it's much cheaper to buy goods in a specific country than maybe it is in the United States or France, then even if they have a lower dollar income, maybe people are living at a higher level than it would appear from their dollar income. So that's what the term purchasing power parity dollars means. Have people heard that term before? It's a way of adjusting for differences in prices and exchange rates and so on. And that's the kind of dollar indicator of a country's level of economic development. The second thing we'll look at is the level of human development. So if we look at just wealth, the 2017 indicators of per capita income, the average level of income when you divide the total gross national income of a country and purchasing power parity dollars by the population of the 25 richest, we're at human development now, sorry. Okay, so of the 25 richest countries in human development, Singapore is the only non-democracy, okay? I'll tell you what human development is in a minute, but basically it's bringing together income levels, educational levels, and levels of health, as measured, for example, by life expectancy or infant mortality. We're not looking at Hong Kong here because it's not an independent country. Of the top 40 countries, okay, when you go down the next step, then you're starting to take in a lot of oil-rich countries that used to be not that high on human development, but now have increasingly improved in their overall level of human development. And so you've got 4 oil-rich countries, one in Southeast Asia, the Kingdom of Brunei, and then 3 other kingdoms, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, that are kind of now in the top 40, not only on per capita income, but in human development. The other generalization we can make is if you look at all of the wealthy democracies that are in the top 25 or top 40, they're liberal democracies. And then I'll just invert it for now so you understand. If you look at all the lower income democracies, most of them are illiberal democracies. Yeah?
So when we're saying which countries have higher and lower income, do we control it all for we look at inequality at all?
No, this is not controlling for inequality except in the following way. The reason why I think it is more revealing to use human development than per capita income is because human development does to some extent control for inequality. Money income can be infinitely unequally distributed. up to the point that one person has all the wealth of the country, right? You can't do that with life expectancy, and you can't do that with educational levels. So if you're looking at health or education, of course there can be inequality in the distribution of that, but there's a natural cap on the inequality. So if you look at the life expectancy measures that will, or the educational measures, that will begin to control for inequality. Okay? But then, of course, you could do a more refined statistical control for inequality. Part of the problem in doing that, I will say, is that the best measure of inequality in income, or you can also do it for wealth, is the Gini coefficient, which gives you a summary measure of the distribution, of the maldistribution of income. The higher the coefficient heading up from 0 toward 1, the more extreme the inequality, the lower the coefficient, the less extreme. And Brazil at like above 0.4 is now has been traditionally a very unequal country. China has gone from being very relatively egalitarian in its distribution of income to also quite extreme in its maldistribution of income. And we don't have that data for all countries. It's very complicated to compile, and so it's only available for certain years and not necessarily for all countries. Whereas we do have all the data on education, on health and quality of life. And so the Human Development Index is available every year for virtually every country, and so it's a much more useful measure in this sense.